You are listening to the People-Centric Podcast, where we talk through the toughest challenges that people face at work and give practical advice to fixing those challenges. Thanks for joining our movement to create workplaces that are happier, healthier, aligned, and empowered by putting people at the center of all that we do.
Hey everybody, Matt Griswold with People-Centric Consulting Group. Welcome to the People-Centric Podcast. Today, what we are going to do is we are going to play a narrative paradigm podcast. It's one of our previous episodes, but I wanted to do you all a favor and help set it up because sometimes we get confused on this term, narrative paradigm. The narrative paradigms are the stories that we as humans tell ourselves with very little information. We're smart adults, so we gather a little bit of information and then we build a spin a whole web off of the little information that we have. We do this quite a bit. The problem with those stories that our brains are telling ourselves is that most of the time, those stories are inaccurate. Give you an example. What happens if you maybe are feeling a little icky, got some symptoms, and so you know what? You do what every American might do is go to WebMD to find out what's going on with you. Chances are by the time your WebMD search is through, you're calling in the family because it doesn't look good, right? I could die 6 different ways tonight. Then it's bad. The reality is that's probably not true. And these are the narrative paradigms, these stories that we tell ourselves. And you can imagine how destructive that might be in the workplace. The us versus them mentality quickly seeps in and starts to be destructive. Silos are being built up. Teams are being divided. The us versus them mentality, like I mentioned, this department versus that department. This is why leadership behaves the way that leadership does. And we start assigning the reasons why we feel that they are doing those things. And so I wanted to set it up because sometimes we feel like, I know what a narrative paradigm is. It's something that I thought this happened and sure enough, it happened. No. That's a true story. If I'm convinced of something and it turns out to be true, that's not a narrative paradigm. A narrative paradigm is something that I have convinced myself of to be true. However, it turns out to be false. And you can see the destructive patterns that might ensue after that. So we hope you enjoy this episode, and we'll be back at the beginning of the year. Happy end of year to you all for 2023. We'll be back in 2024 with brand new episodes from People-Centric Consulting Group. As always, love you. Bye.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this week. On today's podcast, we are talking about conflict. Now, we deal with conflict as consultants a lot. And so we really think that this is an important topic to discuss at the workplace because everyone runs into it. We also feel that there is a way to make conflict really healthy and move organizations forward. But to do that, you have to start with you. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We believe that conflict comes down to about 3 things: miscommunication, narrative paradigms, and assigning intent. And that sounds really consultanty, but we're going to break it down for you. And we're going to talk about what these things are. What is a narrative paradigm? What does it mean to assign intent? And how you can recognize it in yourself and then how you can prevent it. So Don, we deal with conflict so much. Can you tell us one of your favorite conflict stories?
I was working with a client where we were going in and doing what we often do is sometimes we'll start off working with somebody where we interview employees and we interview staff, we interview managers, and we just ask some questions about, tell us about your best day at work, tell us about your worst day. And what we're looking for is learning a little bit about their cultural systems, what's going on internally so that we can really help them and zero in on areas that would make the most impact for the company. And a couple of the employees told me a similar story. And the first one told me the story and said, "You're not going to believe what our boss does. You are not going to believe what this jerk does. This jerk, he has us once a quarter. He tells us, everybody bring the keys to your car in and leave them up front. And what he does is he has his buddy down the street who owns an auto mechanic store come in and he has him do an oil change on our cars in the parking lot. Like he'll go out into the parking lot and all of us get an oil change in the car." And it's just, can you believe that jerk does that? And I'm sitting there listening to this thinking okay. And I said, so does he make you have to pay for that? And then he's giving that money to his friend, or what's going on? He says, no. He doesn't charge us for it. He just does it. He pays for all of it, but he does it. He just does it to give his friend some business. Like, that's the kind of guy this is. Now, I'm sitting here thinking, so wait, your boss gives you free oil changes once a quarter and like does it in the parking lot. Like, isn't that an awesome benefit? Like, and so I said, don't you see that as a benefit? Like, do you think maybe the boss is doing that because they want to show you some appreciation? Like, maybe that's just helping you. This person says, no. It's just, he's being a jerk. He's trying to give his friend some business. That's what he's trying to do. So I went on to interview a few other people, and a couple other people mentioned the same thing. They mentioned this oil change, and it was always in a negative light. Like, yeah, the jerk makes us get oil changes. Like, we can't even pick where we get our own oil changes from. And I kept asking, what's the problem around the oil changes? And they just kept saying, no, you don't understand. He's a jerk. So if he's giving us an oil change, there must be a jerk reason behind it. And that's kind of the theme that kept coming up. It's this paradigm of he's a jerk, so anything he does is jerky, right? That's an idea around a narrative paradigm. So when we think about a narrative paradigm, it's a concept around how we think as humans. We tend to look at the world around us. We get a lot of inputs, a lot of data. And so in order for us to understand all this data that comes to us, we think about it in terms of a story, a narrative. We oversimplify the world around us. Now, there's a problem with this way of thinking, is that once we start to establish the story in our heads, we look for evidence to support the story. So things that happen to us we look for a way to make it fit into the story that we have. If you love President Trump, everything that he says, you think that's awesome. I love what he's saying there. If you hate President Trump, everything he says is negative. It goes against. It's a universal thing. It's not a flaw in how we are as humans. It's just how we think. And that's the paradigm piece. So we tend to think in terms of stories. This comes up a lot in the workplace. Taking a step back, being from the outside of that story. Hey, how many of you listening to this podcast right now would love if your bosses gave you free oil changes in the parking lot at work where you didn't even have to worry about it? Like, that's one less thing you even have to worry about. You don't have to take your car into the mechanic to get oil changes or even do that for yourself at home. They're taking care of that for you, and you don't have to pay for it at all. It's being done by a licensed mechanic. It's all being done well, and it's being paid for. Most of us would really like that. But in this story, they were in a different story. So they were in the story that this boss is a jerk. And a lot of that, it gets to the root of conflicts that we have in the workplace, is this concept of a narrative paradigm. The stories that we create, we get stuck in, and it creates conflict for us as people at work.
Yeah, Don, one of the things I think that makes this super difficult, I know we're going to go through and talk about, okay, so why does this happen? How does this happen? How do I identify that? But one of the things that makes this difficult, like you're alluding to there, is it's kind of happening subconsciously, right? I mean, when we work with different organizations, this is very, very common that we see this. In fact, there's probably people listening that are like, they maybe have decided already, like, this podcast isn't for me. I don't struggle with this at all. But they're thinking about the jerk that they're about to go work for right now, or the peer that is a jerk that they're about to go work for. I like to challenge people too, whenever we start hearing, them talk about people like that. I like to challenge them by saying, let's rewind. Let's back it up a little bit. Like, where did this come from? Because there's always this starting point. And so I kind of want to talk about maybe how does this begin to happen? What are some of those things that start to build this narrative paradigm in the first place? Diana, what do you think? Where does this idea of narrative paradigm come from? Like, how does it begin?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it simply starts by a miscommunication or some perceived injustice. I mean, it could be anything little, and then you in your own mind start to look for things that support the badness that has happened to you. Badness isn't a word, but I just am going to go with it today.
Badness.
Yeah.
Well, you're trying to bring back rad too, and I don't think that's going to work either.
Rad is good and it works.
You could use radness. That's pretty good.
Radness, yeah. But I think And I think this is another thing that we probably need to recognize with this too is okay. So how does it happen? Maybe one of those injustices. Maybe it's a legitimate injustice. Maybe it's a perceived injustice. But this doesn't show any favorites. Narrative paradigms doesn't show any favorites, right? It's not always the employee to the boss. It could be an employee to an employee, or like we've seen with many different organizations, it's from department to department. Too. Those types of things can draw that. Don, maybe talk about in larger organizations when departments, maybe department one works really well. They seem to be hitting on all cylinders, but all of a sudden now they have department two that they have to work with, and anytime they have to work with department two, oh, it's frustrating. Oh, those people, and all of a sudden the language changes. Where does that come from?
So the first thing to understand here is everyone is in a paradigm. I used to work with somebody who used to say, well, I think logically. I don't like to, I'm outside of that. No, everyone's in a paradigm. And when your team is working together really, really well in your department, it's probably because you communicate a lot with each other and you have aligned your stories with each other. So your stories are in alignment with each other. You have the same type of a story and you have some control over that. Whenever another department gets involved, if you haven't worked with them a lot, then what happens is you potentially have some conflict that can occur or some misalignment. And then the story becomes the story about they. And that happens in a lot of organizations. Well, they don't care about the customer as much as we care about it. And you're talking about people who are on the same team ultimately, right? It's two different departments, but you're on the same company.
Trying to solve for the same stuff, right? Trying to solve the same problems.
You're trying to, but then that they word starts to creep in there. And when that they word comes in, it's usually because, well, we think this way and they think this way. Yeah. And you start to really think as a department that you know what their real intentions are. You know why they do what they do. And then so everything they do seems to fit what you think their intentions are. And because you're in that paradigm and they become they, and they do what they do because they are jerks.
Yeah. Bethany, let me ask you a question here too, as far as these narrative paradigms, because I think that's one opportunity or that's one option of where these tend to rear their ugly heads with these narrative paradigms of maybe their process is a little bit different. But what if I'm the manager of one of those groups? And what ownership do I have over my team? If I'm a department leader or manager over the team, what type of ownership or accountability do I have towards my team to maybe protect them from developing some of those negative paradigms with other departments?
Probably just making sure that there is a space for communication, because I think a lot of times those stories happen and they start to be created whenever people are just not talking to each other. And so there's that lack of communication. And so if something happens and it feels like it's a slight against them, but chances are they probably haven't had a conversation with the person that they think has hurt them. And I think that happens a lot in narrative paradigms. So as a manager, making sure that you're creating those intentional spaces for people to talk, whether that's a regular connection point or if you're knowing about, a specific situation and a story that you keep hearing from your team, helping them initiate that conversation that they need to have with the other person.
Yeah, I like that too. If there's a lack of communication, they'll develop their own stories. That's definitely an option. I think sometimes too that the managers might, in a larger organization, might look at their team as their safe place, so to speak, right? Mm-hmm. If they're frustrated with another manager, another department lead, they might look at their team as the safe place to be able to go vent about maybe a frustrating manager meeting that they had. And when we're doing those types of things, Don, what is that manager doing to their team?
Yeah, a manager has a huge role in helping a team create stories. So you have to be really careful because you are very influential just as a manager. We talk about the difference between management and leadership all the time. Management is the authority piece and leadership is the influence, but they are linked. As a manager, you have more influence just naturally because you're the manager. So if you come to a team and you start to feed a story, and it could be just a part of a story that you've heard, then sometimes your team will take that and extrapolate from it and go a bigger direction. So you might have a casual interaction with somebody saying, boy, that person was in a really bad mood today from that other department. And you might mention it to your team casually. That team sometimes takes that as saying, oh, that other department they're not nice, or they don't want to work with us very well. And it can take it to a different degree. So you have to be really careful about what stories are forming on your team, especially as the manager.
Yeah, we've used the statistic before, but 70% of disengagement comes from management, and I think that's it's not a knock against managers. It's to empower them to understand that the level of influence that they have over their team is huge. And this is another example of that level of influence. The manager might be looking for that place to vent. I don't know if in front of the team is that place to vent, because you're helping them to build that narrative paradigm as well. So,
Matt, I had an example of it somewhat recently. I do some work in the community, and we got some feedback from another group in the community about what we were doing that was negative, and I gave the feedback back to our group kind of casually, and I said, "Hey, that group doesn't like what we're doing here." And over the course of the next couple hours, what I started to hear was an emerging story occurring on our team of saying, well, they're a bunch of jerks. What are they doing? They should engage us. They should come in here and do this then. And what should they do? And it really started to spin almost out of control. I could feel a new narrative paradigm forming. And so I engaged it again and just said, hey, look, this feedback is actually legit. We have to be really careful about running down too far from this. So let's ask for a little bit more. Let's tell the other group that we heard them, and let's communicate a little bit. So we actually had some back and forth with the other group, and that interaction ended up being very positive. And so I got to feed that back to the team, and that narrative paradigm shifted back again of, oh, okay, they're just trying to help us. That's why they gave us that feedback. But initially you could feel the story start to come of this other group was really starting to push back. Like that other group, they're being passive aggressive against us, and they don't care about what we're doing. They don't recognize the work that we're doing. It happens really fast, and it's not that there's something wrong with us. Again, it's just how we think in terms of humans. So we have to communicate to stay on the same story. It's incredibly important.
So we're talking about communication and what that looks like. Bethany brought up, creating the space to be able to communicate, to try to combat some of the narrative paradigms. What happens when we come to the realization? So let's say, Don, you just said you were able to communicate, open up some streams there. Now we have recognized we are involved in this narrative paradigm. What are some things now? What do we do with that? I recognize them in the narrative paradigm. What are some of those things that I need to begin to do, or how do I get out of that in the first place?
I think the key is you have to be able to talk through it. You have to get the stories out. So the stories exist inside your head and out loud in front of the team. And it's the one that's inside your head that creates the paradigm. So, but it can come from outside. So when you talk through stories and you start to say, is this the story? Then what it allows you to do is it allows you to kind of compare notes with other people and start to think about, is the story really true? And you can challenge it a little bit. And the earlier you do that, the better off it is. Sometimes I like to say that communication turns conflict into trust on a team. If you can talk about the story that's out there and you can challenge it, which is difficult to do because we don't like to face conflict sometimes. So if Matt and I are disagreeing about something and I'm starting to think, wow, Matt's kind of a jerk, and I feel that narrative paradigm starting to erupt inside my head, the best thing for me to do is to go talk to Matt and say, Matt, this thing happened and it kind of concerns me. I'd like to know a little bit more about what's going on so that I can pull your story out, so I can hear what's going on inside your head and see if it aligns with what I think is happening. And what that helps us to do is when we talk, we can create a new story together, and it's a different story. And it's usually one that's a little bit more positive. And when we do that, that helps to build trust between two people, because it's like, hey, I feel this way. And when I bring it up, it helps deepen a relationship.
And I'm glad you went there, but let's be real. That's a grown-up answer, right? That's not something that we see a whole lot is, you know what? I'm feeling like this. I need to go schedule some time to meet with this person. I think when we're stuck in that narrative paradigm, we're always waiting for the other person to change their behavior. The other person needs to change the behavior. The other person needs to take the first step. But I think, one of those signs of maturity, or one of those recognition, I don't know if we want to put it in the bucket of professionalism or whatever that looks like. And Diana, you mentioned it in the introduction. At the end of the day, we're only accountable for ourselves. How often do we get on phone calls, Diana, whether it's coaching or whether it, somebody just wanted to provide us feedback. So we get those, we get those text messages that are like, we need to talk. Okay. Yeah. We're prepared. We're always ready for that, but we probably know where it's going. What types of things do we hear from them? And then what's our advice to those people on, what they actually can control?
Yeah. Well, I love that you said that that's a grown-up answer, because it is, and you have to be so cognizant of yourself and what you're doing and those around you and the story you're creating, and it's really, really hard to do. And so I know from my personal experience, I was trapped in a narrative paradigm with someone that I worked with, and I just did not like this person. Like, it was hard to work with. I had talked to them several times to try to fix communication, but again, we communicated very differently. So that made it even harder. And every time we communicated, it just fed my story. And so I often tell people to go to the person that likes the person that you don't like, right? And ask them their perspective, help them
Oh,
see what they see. And so when I was really
Yeah, that's
deep
good.
in my conflict with this person, I went to their friend and I was like, hey, I'm struggling with my relationship with this person. Can you help me understand what's in their head? And they were totally great. They were like, oh, yeah, this person, she just does it this way. And I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. And I needed someone else to kind of pull me out of it.
Yeah, and sometimes we do need that, mediator, that third party, whether it's us at peoplecentric.com or anybody, all right? Any of those other mutual third party people that can also help lead the discussion that maybe isn't caught up in the same things that you're caught up in.
Yeah, yeah, and it really did help me when they helped explain how this person saw the world or how this person worked through things, because it wasn't the person that I hated talking about it, right? It was someone else, someone not related to the story or the situation, and they could just give me that outside perspective a little bit, and it helped shape my brain back to normal.
It's kind of that. What a great way to say it, right? It's helped shape my brain because you are kind of having to retrain your thought process, so
Mhm.
you don't think like that, or that you don't instinctively think like that, or reactively think like that. So if we're following this process, if we're following this pattern, so this you have this element of miscommunication or a perceived injustice, which leads kind of this negative paradigm where we're assigning this negative intent. But then we also have this idea of, okay, I've recognized that. Now we've opened up lines of communication. Okay, I see that they're not just trying to sabotage me all the time. I see that they're not trying to make a train wreck of my life at work all the time. And now I'm starting to think about that. Think about that differently. So ongoing communication. Don, what's the quote that you say about communication and how it cures things?
yeah. Communication is the cure for imperfection.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
so we don't have the right stories all the time because it's so complex. We don't have the right relationships. We do have conflict with the people that we work with. As long as we communicate that, we can get past that imperfection and make it better. But I loved your point, Matt, of like that's the adult way of handling it. Like it's easy to say that, but we see that in most organizations. Probably most of the time, what happens is people don't say anything because they don't want to have that conflict.
Yeah, well, and I think to the point of, how if you're a leader within your organization, if you're a manager or whatever, how do you go about sort of fixing this problem now that you've realized that you're in the narrative paradigm too? So yeah, you should have a conversation with somebody, right? You should maybe get that third party involved, but then you also have, if you have extended it to your team, you have a responsibility to your team too, to help kind of resolve that as well. So like we talked about before, potentially making a meeting space, but it's also modeling it and just stopping it. So if you're having those conversations and feeding that story to your team, obviously just being really mindful to make sure that you're stopping that. And then as you're hearing it, it might be just literally addressing your whole team and saying, hey, we've been creating this story. We need to stop it. And here's why. That might be altogether, that might be on an individual basis because maybe it isn't everybody. But I think it's something where you have to be, create a habit almost where you're going to be just kind of open to sort of call each other out, but not in a really hateful way necessarily, but being willing to have those conversations, and make it, I think that's where you can make it open and say, to create that accountability, to say, hey, I've been doing this too, so if you hear me say something, I also need you, as my employee, to also say something to me if I'm kind of feeding into that story too.
Yeah, good stuff. And this is called the More Than Work podcast. So you can use this this isn't just at work, right? This is life. So you might be, if there's a relationship you're struggling with, or, not that we're relationship counselors, well, kind of, but if there's a relationship you're struggling with, maybe that a relationship that's fractured, there's a chance that a narrative paradigm is being played out now in your own mind. So maybe you're on your way to work and you're kind of dreading the work day, or the relationship, or the partnership, or the team member, or the employee. There, you're not broken. This is something that we see fairly often. Communication is the cure for imperfection, and so this idea that, okay, maybe we just need to have a conversation. It might be awkward, it might be uncomfortable, but if we're trying to get out of that narrative paradigm, and have more fruitful working relationships, then it's a necessary step.
Thank you for listening to the People-Centered Podcast. We are so grateful for you joining us every week. If you like this content, please like and subscribe. Also, feel free to share on your social media with everyone that you know. It really does help us. If you would like to contact us, I have put our information in the show notes. Please reach out anytime. We love hearing from you. We will be back next week with a new topic. Until then, be well and lead well.